Right, so in this section, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the English colonial population and culture. And so you'll by the way notice that sometimes my lectures coincide with the textbook. Other times I incorporate other things outside of it. Okay, so just want to throw that out there as well. So life in New England. So we're talking about Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Okay, and I just thought some of this would be interesting. So in the northern parts, um, in New England, those lifespans were about equal to the 20th century. And so the question is why? Clean water, cool climate, and disease-free. It's not something that they necessarily know for sure why. In the southern parts, throughout the 17th century, average life expectancy of men was just over 40 years, and about one-third of all marriages lasted more than 10 years. 1 in 4 children died, and half died before 20. Okay, so um, you know, sometimes when we look back on the past, it's easy to take for granted that yes, okay, they live differently than us, but then we don't always necessarily think about how that impacts people. I mean, I just want you to think about 1 in 4 children dying, and think about in certain parts where the life expectancy of men is just over 40. I am 41. I am close to dead right here on in the South. Ugh, right? Okay, so now, what about women? There were more men than women. High mortality rate altered traditional family structures, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. More than one-third of marriages occurred with bride already pregnant. Might surprise you. Life consumed with childbearing for most women. More freedom than women in other places. And this is going to change in the early 18th century. So, first of all, let's ground ourselves more in what we're talking about. Yes, we have pockets of these colonists who are very religious and they live by what we would call traditional family values, okay, biblical based, for example, very clearly. But first of all, we should remind ourselves that's the ideal, and second, that you know, not everybody. When you don't have something that's very cohesive, when you don't have a kind of already a civilization in which you're used to, where the clergy is already there, and you're going off into other parts, it's easy to see how a commitment to a set of standards that might be normal would be compromised. Okay, I always talk about it's the Vegas syndrome, and whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. When people say that, what they're saying is we would do something here we wouldn't normally do somewhere else because it's Vegas after all, and we can leave that behind. And I think a lot of people get like that as they venture off into spaces where you're not being held accountable to society as much, or whatever, the people that know and look at you every day at work and so forth. So um, it shouldn't surprise us then too much that you have actually maybe what we'd call free love happening, in certain parts. That would be scandalous, but you notice that it's going to change later as society, as civilization, in the sense of the colonists are going to solidify colonies into cities and states. You're going to see all of this get a little bit more reined in, to say the least. Okay, um, and so that's just something that I wanted to point out. What about women in New England? Life for them, more immigrants arrived with family members there. So fewer women became widows, and as in the South, most were consumed with childbearing. Um, and so, you know, fewer became pregnant before marriage, but still as high as 20% on some communities. The populations of girls, those names were Prudence, Patience, Chastity, and Comfort. So let's just talk about this. Here, obviously, you're going to have a little bit more of what we consider traditional. Um, and women are going to be spending most of their time pregnant. And again, why are you having so many babies? You're also know that many of them are not going to live um, for the through childhood. So that's something else you have to consider. Now, what are the ideals for women here in their names? Prudence, patience, chastity, comfort. Um, the names right there kind of say it all, right? What the expectations of the roles of women. So we have a very traditional gender type of relationships in which men are expected to be able to be one thing and girls another, like chastity. But women, like all people in history that are pinned down by norms of a dominant group, often defy that. Anne Hutchinson of Boston is just one that I just kind of want to briefly mention, but she's significant in that here's a woman who's a mother of 15 children. 15. That is doable somehow. My ex-wife, she has an adopted sister who's a cousin who is about, I think she is the 15th child out of 15 kids. And her mom spent most of her time pregnant in life. And so she's definitely living that traditional household wife life in that sense. But she becomes condemned by many clergy. Well, why? She basically stood up with her own ideas about spirituality and so forth. She upset gender role expectations. She developed a large following. And because of this, she was put on trial for heresy. And she was banished as a woman not fit for our society. It is a big deal. And being banished, I want you to think about this. Outside is the frontiers, and you're dealing with Native Americans who, for obvious reasons, are not necessarily happy with these colonists. And in fact, in 1643, she was killed in a Native American uprising in New Netherlands. But we'll read more about her and her legacy, and I just want to kind of encourage you to explore these kind of interesting women in our earlier parts of our history. Okay. Now we can talk a little bit about the Quakers. The Quakers, the Society of Friends, who still have a presence. They grew out of the teachings of George Fox in England. And in Rhode Island, 36 governors in the first 100 years were Quakers. Okay, so a very strong influence on early colonial life. In fact, Pennsylvania was established by an affluent Quaker named William Penn, and in 1682, and as American state run under Quaker principles. For them, women did have equal positions in the church, and they still now, take on kind of what we'd call progressive political ideas often. But an interesting religion and culture. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit more about the leisure life of the Puritans, and this book I want to highly recommend. It's called Puritans at Play, and this is where I get a lot of the information from in my next section. Leisure and Recreation in Colonial New England. And so what I want to say is I want to warn you that we're going to talk about something from the Puritans and their sexuality that is maybe something you don't expect. And so I just want to make sure that you're aware before I go to this next clip. Okay, actually, I'm just kidding. They're Puritans. They didn't do anything that interesting. Sorry. So, for sex, it was considered inappropriate. They were against inappropriate adventures in bed with their, between husband and wife, which would lead a husband to play the adulterer with his wife. That's somewhat vague, is it not? But we can probably assume getting a little bit too kinky, then reflects maybe something of going into prostitution, a place of prostitution, as opposed to a morally sound household. Now, I'm going to end right there, and we'll go back into some of the topics of the Puritans. And forgive me for that. But anyways, okay, move on to the next section.